Shabbat Shalom from St. Francisville.
Woohoo! All right, so want me to do the opening or you do that? Okay.
Good morning and Shabbat Shalom. As you can tell, Ross is not here today, so we will be enjoying a teaching from Jodelle Onstadt, and I will begin by reciting the Shema. Turn with me to Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 4 through 9. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one Lord, and thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all your heart and all your soul and all your might. And these words which I command you this day shall be in your heart, and you shall teach them diligently to your children, and shall talk of them when you sit in your house, when you walk by the way, when you lie down, and when you rise up. And you shall bind them for a sign upon your hand, and they shall be as frontlets between your eyes. And you shall write them upon the post of your house and on your gates. The 10 words is Exodus chapter 20. And God spoke all these words, saying, I am the Lord your God, which brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. And you shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make unto you any graven image or any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that is in the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. You shall not bow down yourself to them, nor serve them. For I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers upon the children unto the 3rd and 4th generation of them that hate me, and showing mercy unto thousands of them that love me and keep my commandments. You shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain, for the Lord will not hold him guiltless that takes his name in vain. Remember the Sabbath day, to keep it holy. 6 days shall you do all your labor and do all your work. But the 7th day is the Sabbath of the Lord thy God, and in it you shall not do any work, you, nor your son, nor your daughter, your manservant, nor your maidservant, nor your cattle, nor the stranger that is within your gates. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea, and all that in them is, and rested the 7th day. Wherefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and hallowed it. Honor your father and your mother, that thy days may be long upon the land which the Lord thy God gives you. You shall not kill, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not steal, you shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. You shall not covet thy neighbor's house, thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's wife, nor his manservant, nor his maidservant, nor his ox, nor his ass, nor anything that is thy neighbor's.
Good morning. I'm glad to have you guys with us. Shabbat Shalom from the historic Temple Sinai in St. Francisville, Louisiana. We are coming here thanks to a grant from the Julius Fahan Foundation and the St. Francisville Historic Society. So we are very grateful for the use of this building, for the history that it represents, and for the ability to speak to you this morning. So this morning I am wanting to talk to you about hearing the voice of God, something that we have lost over the past 2,500 years. But before I can share with you some of the things that have occurred in Israel's history and some of the things that have kind of precluded or occluded us from being able to hear this voice, I want to share with you a story that is both improbable, a story that is hard to believe, and a story that I believe enlightens our path today to hear God's word once more. I want to tell you a story about a man that was chosen to be leader over the people, a man whose life was not always exemplary. He grew up in a life of privilege. His family were immigrants, and he had arisen above the station of those in his class. This caused those within his class to become jealous. He loved his people. He also had a temper that he could easily lose. He did not always obey the rule of law. He had been put on trial and condemned by the leaders of the land. He actually had committed a crime that few of us would ever dream of committing. Yet God chose this man to lead his people. He married foreign women. His family and his near kinsmen joined him in encouraging the leading of the nation in hope for a better and greater future. Later in his life, he challenged the ruling authority of his day. He asked for rights for the people that none before him had dreamt. He was not an eloquent speaker, and in fact, it was better if others spoke in his stead. He was determined to deliver his people to a great future. He endured hardship for the sake of the people and the nation he loved. How did this great people repay him? How did they repay his leadership? First, let me share with you something more that an insight this leader had. He understood that Israel's sovereignty over the promised land was key to the nation's success. But the people repaid him by questioning and asking what right did he have to lead the nation to a better and greater future. And what about his crimes? Well, you see, Moses had committed murder. And not only had he committed murder, he had murdered an Egyptian, a protected and elite class of people that had rights far above immigrant citizens. He had murdered this Egyptian when he had lost his temper. And although he had lost his temper, he lost it because he saw his people being abused. He had not always followed the Abrahamic covenant, for he had not circumcised his sons. He had married a Midianite and an Ethiopic woman. He did not follow God's commands when speaking to the rock at Kadesh, but rather he hid it. But despite his flaws, despite his shortcomings, God chose him. God chose Moses to lead his people. And God spoke through Moses to Israel. Understanding Moses' complicated and sordid past helps us to understand God's need to sanctify Moses, to make sure the people knew beyond a shadow of a doubt that Yahweh had indeed chosen Moses as his spokesperson. God used an audible voice to sanctify Moses because Israel needed to hear this. Israel needed some sort of tangible evidence, something they could see and hear to know that Moses was indeed God's spokesman. So in Exodus 19:9, God has a plan. And you find that God often has a plan when you read through the text. So what we find in Exodus 19:9 was that God would speak through an audible voice to the entire nation of Israel to sanctify Moses in this godly ordained role. And this is what God says. In Exodus 19, verse 9, Yahweh said to Moses, "Lo, I come to you in a thick cloud, that the people may hear when I speak with you and believe you forever." So the entire purpose of God speaking the 10 words at Mount Sinai, that entire purpose was to sanctify Moses as his mouthpiece. If you'll skip down to Exodus 19, verse 9, you will find that God fulfills this promise. In Exodus 19, verse 19, it states, "And when the voice of the trumpet sounded long and waxed louder and louder, Moses spoke, and God answered him by voice." So there was some sort of active conversation going on in front of all these people that were at the base of the mountain before Moses and before Yahweh. Moses would say something and God would respond. and then Moses would say something, and the people would hear God respond. So this must have been an awe-inspiring experience. And the people witnessed this. They witnessed Moses' ability before all of them, the whole congregation, to talk directly with Jehovah. God's plan worked, and the people believed. This is why you read in Exodus 20, verse 19, the people say to Moses, "You speak with us, and we will hear, but don't let God speak with us, lest we die." The whole entire purpose of God's mission and speaking to Moses in front of the whole entire congregation had been accomplished. Moses now stood basically in Jehovah's stead to speak Jehovah's word that God had given, or that God would give through him throughout the revelation of his covenant. But there was something more than this. God didn't just sanctify Moses through his voice. Jehovah also sanctified the covenant itself. Through Jehovah's voice, he spoke his 10 words so that Israel could hear and they could obey. And this was God's instruction to Israel in Exodus 19, verse 5. And yes, we are jumping around a little bit, but I think jumping around kind of fills in the pieces of the story so we can see how they are connected and interrelated to each other. So go back to Exodus 19, verse 5. Jehovah says, "Therefore, if you will obey my voice and keep my covenant, then you will be a particular treasure to me above all the people in the earth, for the earth is mine." So notice this commandment. This commandment is basically to the Shema. Hear, O Israel. And what is it that we are supposed to hear in God's voice? Well, we're supposed to hear that small, still voice that says, "Keep my covenant. This is my way, walk in it." What we find is a timeless instruction, an instruction that transcends millennia. It transcends political authority. It transcends religious authority, whether ancient or modern. And in all cases, the sound of this message is the same. This is my way. This is my covenant. Walk in it, that you may live. Exodus 20, verse 22, draws attention to the fact that Jehovah has spoken with Israel and that they had indeed heard Jehovah's voice. They had heard Jehovah's voice speaking to them and speaking directly to Moses. And in verse 22, Exodus 20:22, God brings up this fact again, and he says, "You have heard me talk with you from heaven." So this was a very awe-inspiring event. It sanctified Moses again as God's mouthpiece and sanctified Israel in the covenant. But there's something about this covenant that we need to be very much aware of, and something that is a step towards us hearing God's voice again and coming to also understand how this voice has been silenced over the last 2,500 years. The first thing to take away from this is that at Mount Sinai, God's voice was fully, not only God's voice, but his covenant with Israel was fully disclosed. His plan of salvation was readily available. The knowledge was there. It was plain and simple, and the whole entire nation of Israel understood it. There was nothing hidden or secreted about it. He would save the nation through the voice that spoke to Israel and to Moses by teaching Israel how to live. He would save Israel through a set of laws that created a righteous society. In Deuteronomy 30, verses 11 through 14, God reiterates the openness and the full disclosure that occurred with his revelation of his 10 words, or the 10 categories of his law at Mount Sinai. Israel could plainly hear and plainly understand, plainly discern the intent and the full meaning of God's covenant. And this is why God reiterates this in Deuteronomy 30, verses 11 through 14, through Moses. And he states, "For this commandment which I have given you this day, it is not hidden from you, neither is it far off. It is not in heaven that you should say, 'Who shall go up into heaven and bring it to us that we may hear and do it?'" Notice this emphasis on hearing, this ability to hear and to discern. "Neither is it beyond the sea that you should say, 'Who shall go over the sea for us that we may hear it and do it?' But the word is very close to you. It's in your mouth and it's in your heart that you may do it." So we find that at the end of Israel's Exodus wanderings, by the end of the 40 years that Israel spent right before she's coming in to the promised land, Israel had the covenant. It was in her heart, it was very close to her, and it was very easy for her to hear it, to discern it, to do it, and put it into action. But Israel had this tendency, and I think kind of all of us have this tendency, where we just have this craving for a really good mystery. We love suspense. It's so much more fulfilling and interesting when you don't know the end of the storyline, when you enjoy the journey of getting there. And teachers have found throughout the millennia that you gain a lot larger following, you amass a lot larger gathering when you have a really good mystery to tell, when you have something that's hidden, when you have something that you know and nobody else, and something that you can find is some sort of hidden knowledge in the covenant. Well, evidently this was a significant issue for the prophets and the leaders of Isaiah during Isaiah's day, because Isaiah found himself having to remind Israel, her leaders, her priests, how easy and how openly discernible God's truths were. In Isaiah 45:19, once again he had to remind Israel that his truths were easily discernible, that he had not hidden or secreted any truths at Mount Sinai. So in Isaiah 45, verse 19, Isaiah reminds the people that God had not spoken in secret in the dark places of the earth. He did not say to the seed of Jacob, "Seek me in vain." But he said, "I, Yahweh, speak righteousness. I declare the things that are right." So not only was this idea plainly open and acknowledgeable, but it was also righteous. God had declared it to Israel a righteous way full of justice and judgment that Israel should walk in. If Yahweh did not speak in secret or in the dark places of the earth, he had given Israel his truth without reserve. Israel could both see and hear Yahweh's voice echoing through the timeless precepts of his covenant, a covenant whose words were unchanging then as they are today. Isaiah 46, verse 16, once again had to challenge Israel's love of the mysteries within the pagan deities of the day. Israel's love for a good thriller that would not necessarily disclose the end of the story. So in Isaiah 46, verses 16 through 17, Isaiah states, "Come near to me and hear you this." Notice this command for us to hear and understand. "I have not spoken in secret from the beginning, from the time that was, there am I. And now, O Yahweh, and his Spirit that has sent me, thus says Yahweh, your Redeemer, the Holy One of Israel, I am Yahweh your God that teaches you to profit, which leads you by the way wherein you should go." So God had fully disclosed the stipulations of it and the consequences of his covenant. He had given the 10 words as stipulations. The law of Moses applied those to real life. He made those 10 categories, rules and laws by which Israel should live by in her day-to-day living. Things like do not bear false witness in a court case, be honest and truthful. He made it, if you steal, there were penalties for stealing, such as 4 and 5 times the amount of things that were stolen. But he also gave Israel blessings. He promised them blessings for following and curses if Israel broke that covenant. Israel agreed to these terms. Yet Israel also hardened her heart and she rebelled. When God applied the terms, which we today call curses, or we recognize as curses of the law of the contract, Israel would complain as though she had no idea why calamity was coming upon her. Israel would feign ignorance as though she did not understand why trial, war, and hardship came upon her. But there is one particular curse in the law today that can turn back all the curses of time. That hearing of this curse and understanding of it restores our hearing and puts in motion the process of opening our ears to discern truth today. It is a curse that silenced our ability to hear God's words. It's a curse that continues to affect each of us. And this particular curse is in Deuteronomy 28, verses 28 through 29. It is the curse of noonday, the curse that recognizes the beginning of the hiding of the face from Israel and from humanity. This is what the curse states. Yahweh will smite you with madness and blindness and astonishment of heart. You will grope at noonday as the blind gropes in darkness. You will not prosper in your ways. You shall only be oppressed and spoiled forevermore, and no man shall save you. This verse, the curse of noonday, the concept there is that you have light, you have truth, you have knowledge and understanding. And at the brightest point of the day, at high noon, when it is least expected, darkness falls on the land. People begin to no longer hear, no longer see, and no longer understand. In the symbolism of the temple, this was visualized as the covenant, the testimony residing within the Ark of the Covenant that is hidden behind a veil and obscured from the sight of the people. Isaiah refers to this as the veiling of truth, the veiling of what is known, and a thick blanket of darkness that transcends over the eyes of all people. David in Psalm 69:23 builds on this concept, and he foretells, or he prophesies to Israel, how God would repay the brokenness of his covenant, how he would repay Israel's lack of love of truth and lack of the love of him. And this is what Isaiah says. Let their eyes be darkened that they see not. Make their loins continually to shake. And that is Psalm 69:23. Being unable to hear, Israel would live a life in anxiety and fear. If you are unable to see, if you're unable to hear, there's a lot of anxiety as to what is before you, what obstacles are in the way, what is going to come next. And you find that this idea is reiterated over and over again by the prophets. There is darkness, Israel is unable to see, she becomes drunk, she becomes anxious and fearful, and then you find that hammer of judgment falls on the people in a very horrific way. Amos 8, verses 9 and 10 builds on this concept, prophesying about 200 years after King David, Amos builds on this prophecy of the judgment and at noonday once more. And this is what he says. It shall come to pass in that day that Yahweh of hosts, I will cause the sun to go down at noon, and I will darken the earth on a clear day, and I will turn your feast into mourning and your songs into lamentation. I will bring up a sackcloth upon all your loins, and baldness upon every head. I will make it as the morning of an only son, and the end thereof as a grievous day. Notice there are three specific traits in this particular prophecy. The first is that the sun goes down at noon and that the earth becomes darkened. After that, Israel's feasts go from joy into mourning. And then number 3, there's the sackcloth and the grieving of the death throughout the land. And this really parallels in many ways the curses and the plagues that God had sent on Egypt. Those curses that he had sent on Egypt are now being retributed on God's firstborn son, Israel. So throughout this, and I really encourage you, put this in your notes, read the entire context of Amos 8, because he really sheds light on this whole entire epic of Israel's history. Micah also, in Micah chapter 3, refers to this portion of the testimony. Micah was contemporary with Amos, and his prophecy tells the same story. In Micah 3, chapters 6 through 7, he says, "Night shall be to you, and you shall have no vision. It shall be a darkened day to you, and you shall not divine. The sun shall go down over the prophets, and it shall be dark over them. Your seers shall be ashamed, and your diviners confounded. Yes, they shall cover their lips, for there is no answer from God." This again builds upon the Song of Moses in Deuteronomy 31 and 32, which speaks of this hiding of the face. This where God hides his face from humanity, especially from Israel. He does not listen to their voice. He does not hear their cry. But even more than this is that not only is there no answer from God, but God's voice for us fades into oblivion. Israel's ears are becoming heavier and heavier. Israel's sight is becoming dimmer and dimmer. But how did this happen? How did Israel become unable to hear and to discern Yahweh's voice for herself? A voice that had once been openly disclosed to her. A voice that spoke and made God's way simple, that was not hidden, and that had not been diminished. How did God's voice become diminished? The answer to this is found in Isaiah, and it is Isaiah's entire mission for Israel. And I encourage you to keep this in mind anytime you open the pages of Isaiah. The sole mission of Isaiah was to carry forth the judgment at noonday and to make it happen. Just as Yahweh had spoken to Moses and chosen Moses to openly reveal God's truth, he would now choose another man for himself. Only this man would hide and obscure the plain truth God had given to Israel. Isaiah bore the heavy task of obscuring God's voice and blinding Israel's sight. Turn with me to Isaiah chapter 6, verses 8 through 9. And we are going to read the entire purpose of Isaiah's mission, the entire purpose of his book for Israel. And in Isaiah 6, verse 8, Isaiah says, "I heard the voice of Yahweh." And now this is a vision. This is a vision that Isaiah is having. He says, "Whom shall I send, and whom will go for us?" Then Isaiah says, "Here am I, send me." And he says, "Go tell this people to hear, but do not understand. See, but do not perceive. Make the heart of this people fat. Make their ears heavy. Shut their eyes, lest they see with their eyes, hear with their ears, understand with their heart, be converted, and be healed. Isaiah bears a heavy mission. It's a sad one. It is a one that brings Israel's curses upon them, that obscures their understanding of a plainly discernible law. He makes them blind and deaf to the hearing of God's words. Israel had loved false gods. She had loved stories filled with mystery, suspense, and intrigue. So now God would give her the greatest suspense thriller in history, a book that would rival no other, with the implications that it would have in store for her life in reality. God gives Isaiah 4 specific missions. Number 1, to make the people hear but not understand, to see but not grasp or discern what is being said. 3, to make the people's heart fat. He would give them the pagan doctrines that they loved. And 4, he would make their ears heavy so that they do not understand. This again brings about the hiding of the face, the casting of the veil over the nations. So the question becomes, inquiring minds want to know, how did Isaiah do this? How did he fulfill God's mission to him? Well, the first thing that he does is he mixes up the chronology of his book. So when you read through the book of Isaiah, if you just start with Isaiah 1:1 and you read all the way to the back of the book, it's not in chronological order. You have to look for the phrase in the year of, or in the month of, or in the days of, for the dating of that particular text of prophecy. That's number 1. Number 2, the testimony of Deuteronomy. The curses specifically of Deuteronomy 28 are listed in a very chronological order. They define a law that governs all prophecy. Within Isaiah's testimony, he mixes all of these prophecies up so that one comes before another and it's not in a natural order. But the other thing that Isaiah uses, the other technique, is that he writes in such a way that his book is full of mystery. It is written so universally and so generically that to one group of text you could attribute 3 to 4 different points of view, not seeing one point of view necessarily clearly. But the most significant and overarching method that Isaiah uses to obscure the truth, and his book is completely true, but the way that he obscures truth is by being very verbose, in the sheer essence and length and duration of his book. He will often state one thing 2 different ways. He'll talk about the same subject, and in this chapter, he'll describe it using this particular set of words. He'll describe it again in another chapter using a different set of words. Or he may tell his scribes what to write, and they will put it in their own words, and they will further obscure what Isaiah is saying. So oftentimes you find that you have 1, 2, or 3 prophecies of the exact same thing, but you're not able to discern that because they're written differently. So I want to give a real life example. I want to show you how being verbose and overly wordy and overly long of duration makes it hard to understand what is really being said. So listen to this following very wordy paragraph. Many have made the wise observation that when a stone is in motion, rolling down a hill or incline, that the moving stone is not as likely to be covered all over with a kind of thick green moss that grows on stationary, unmoving things and becomes a nuisance, and suggests that those things haven't moved in a long time and probably won't move anytime soon. Can any of you guys tell me what I just said? Did you get a little lost? So I can tell you in 6 words what 67 words could not tell you. In 6 words, the entire point of that paragraph is that a rolling stone gathers no moss. But being verbose hid the entire message. Now, I am well aware that there are opinions out there that my very long and lengthy and verbose volume 1 also does that to some extent. And I will admit that when I go back and gaining the years and the experience of further writing, I do see that. There's some things I go back and I see how I have used too many words to explain an idea, and I honestly cringe. I cringe at being too verbose. So when you use conciseness, the message comes through. Notice that we have no trouble in Deuteronomy recognizing the overarching theme. The overarching theme of Deuteronomy is to love Yahovah, to keep his commandments. And this is told over and over again. But we find that there really isn't an overarching theme that really comes out clearly in the book of Isaiah. We have a lot of words, we have a lot of truth, but you find that his words put us in a state of deep sleep. We begin to hear the words of Isaiah over the words of Yahovah. And through this method, Isaiah fulfills his godly, divinely ordained mission. He fulfills his judgment, a very particular curse of the law, to make the sun go down at noonday. And Isaiah even recognizes in Isaiah 29, verse 10, he recognizes the fact that he has done this. And he prophesies to Israel, telling them in 29, verse 10, "For Yahovah has poured on you the spirit of deep sleep. He has closed your eyes, the prophets of your rulers and the seers he has covered." And then again in Isaiah 60, verse 2, he again reiterates that it isn't just a darkness that covers Israel. This darkness covers the entire earth. And he writes, "For behold, the darkness shall cover the earth, and gross darkness covers the people." So this judgment at noonday began this process of the hiding of the face. It began this process of people walking in their own ways. But ultimately, the ultimate consequence of this is that people would look to the words of men rather than to the words of God and the hearing of God's voice. It began the process of closing the ears and blinding the eyes to see, because people would now look to men and the learning of men rather than to the simply and openly disclosed words of Yahovah. Isaiah reiterates this fact again in Isaiah 29. So Isaiah 29, 11 through 12. And this is going to be 11 through 12, and then we're going to skip down to verse 14. And this is what Isaiah says would become the end result of his vision. That it would become as words of a book that is sealed, which men deliver one that is learned, saying, "Read this, I pray you." And he said, "I cannot, for it is sealed." And the book is delivered to him that is learned, saying, "Read this, I pray you." And he said, "I am not learned." Verse 14. Therefore, behold, I will proceed to do a marvelous work among this people, even a marvelous work and a wonder. For the wisdom of their wise men shall perish, and the understanding of their prudent men shall be hid. Now, what Isaiah is not telling you is that he is actually doing this and accomplishing this throughout the words of his book. He observes that he has filled this mission. And not only does he observe that he has fulfilled his commission, but he also recognizes that the consequence of the people becoming drunk, of them becoming blind, of going into this stupor where they no longer hear the voice of God because the voice of men is too loud in their ears, he recognizes that it has a catastrophic consequence. So when Isaiah sees this, he wants to know, how long is this horrific judgment going to last? How long will Israel be blind? How long will Israel trip over her own 2 feet as she seeks in vain to hear the word of Yahweh? So in Isaiah 6, Yahweh tells Isaiah how long it will last and how long the hiding of the face will endure. So look at Isaiah 6, verses 11 through 13. Then I said, O Yahweh, how long? And he answered, until the cities be wasted without inhabitant, and the houses of man and the land be utterly desolate. And Yahweh will have removed men far away, and there will be a great forsaking in the midst of the land. Now, I'm going to pause here for a minute. Just put this in your notes. This portion of the prophecy totally coincides with the testimony of Leviticus 26, verses 29 through 31. This is the portion of Israel's history where both the monarchies fall, both the house of Ephraim or house of Israel as well as the house of Judah. You find that Israel is being deported. The land is becoming utterly desolate. This means that the men and women of Israel, the families of Israel, are being taken away off of the promised land. The land of Israel is beginning to enjoy her Sabbaths. And notice it specifically states, and Yahweh has moved men far away. And then there is a forsaking in the midst of the land. The land becomes empty, it becomes desolate, and very few are left in the land. But then the prophecy skips to verse 13, Isaiah 6, verse 13. And at this point, he begins to talk about the return of the second temple remnant under Zerubbabel and Ezra. And in this, he talks about what would happen with this second temple remnant. And in verse 13, he says, but yet in it shall be a tenth, and it shall return and be eaten. And it shall be eaten as a teal tree and as an oak, in whose substance is in them. And they cast their leaves, so the holy seed shall be the substance thereof. So Yahweh is showing to Isaiah that when the second temple remnant returns, they're not returning for salvation, but for judgment. They're going to be eaten. Only a tenth of Israel would return to the land, and they are returning for judgment, not salvation. Now, the word for substance is actually very poorly translated, as it actually means matzaba, which is a pillar. So it's talking about this pillar of Israel that returns, but it becomes desecrated. It becomes a prey, and it is torn down. It says that Israel is like a teal tree. Now, teal trees grow in a very isolated region, and they are all alone, and they can be easily trampled on. And you find this really kind of describes the history of the Second Temple period until the fall of Herod's temple in 70 CE. Jeremiah gives a similar prophecy for Babylon that very much mirrors this portion of the testimony. Let me go back here because I missed my note. This portion of the testimony also follows Leviticus, I think it's right around 42 and 43, where it talks about Israel returning to the land and then the land being forsaken of Israel once more. But then if we go to Jeremiah 51, verses 39 through 40, Jeremiah gives almost the same prophecy for Babylon and her inhabitants that Isaiah 6 had given for Israel. Notice how similar these prophecies are. Yahweh would make Babylon's heart heavy. He would make her belly fat. He would cause them to become drunk and glad in their sleep. But then while they were sleeping, judgment will come. Turn to Jeremiah 51, verses 39 through 40. In their heart I will make their feet, in their heat I will make their feast, and I will make them drunken, that they may rejoice and sleep a perpetual sleep, and not wake, says Yahweh. And I will bring them down like lambs to the slaughter, like rams with the he-goats. So notice, in all of this really parallels the Song of Moses in Deuteronomy 31 and 32. You find that the heart of the people waxes fat, they grow wealthy, they grow happy in their wealth and in their peace and their stability. But at the same time, their eyes grow dim at the same time. Their ears hear too many things, and they listen to the words of too many men to discern the original simple truths found in the voice of God. They become drunk, and they depart from Yahweh. They begin to sleep in the righteousness of their own ways that are not righteous at all. And then, unexpectedly, God's horrific Holocaust follows in the face of war, genocide, famine, and the tremendous loss of life. But notice that after these things happen, that they don't endure forever. Isaiah also tells us the end of this curse. This prophecy that is in our past, whereby Israel has been given a prey to all nations, that curse has been accomplished, and we are on the other side of it today. So Isaiah also tells us the overarching kind of overview of Israel's history during this time, during the hiding of the face, when she would be blind and when she would be deaf to God's words. Now, these verses are kind of interspersed, so I will be jumping around because there's kind of like two conversations going on at the same time in Isaiah 42. So read with me. We're going to read Isaiah 42, 15 through 17 and 18, but then we're going to skip around just a little bit. So this is what Isaiah tells Israel Yahweh will do with them. It says, I will make waste mountains and hills. I will dry up the herbs, and I will make the rivers islands. I will dry up the pools. So we're talking about a great famine. I will bring the blind by a way that they knew not. Now, let me just pause here for a minute, because remember, at Mount Sinai, Israel had known God's ways. Israel was not blind. She was full of sight. She fully saw. She fully comprehended the way of Yahweh. But now Isaiah has made them blind, and now she's going to go out of the way. Israel will go by a way that they knew not, a way that she had not known, as her fathers serve idols of wood and stone that her fathers had not known. Continuing, I will lead them in paths that they have not known. I will make darkness light before them and crook things straight. So this is kind of the undoing. These things I will do to them, but yet in all this I will not forsake them. Yes, they will be turned back. They will be greatly ashamed that trust in graven images, that say to molten images, you are our gods. But notice the command at this point in Isaiah's prophecy. Notice what he says. Hear you who are deaf, and look and see you who are blind. So what is it that we are to look? What are we to look to? What are we to see? And what is it that we are to hear again? And what is the remedy? Well, it's not much of a mystery. Skip down to Isaiah 42:21. For Yahweh is well pleased for his righteousness' sake. He will magnify the law and make it honorable. So we find that the noonday curse comes full circle. The healing of the breach comes by realizing that Yahweh's constitutional law is honorable and relevant even today, that his precepts are timeless and valid for all generations. So as we return to obey God's covenant, it begins to remove the hiding of the face. It enables us to begin to once again hear God's voice and remove the curse of noonday. So how do we, in a very practical application, how can you and I begin to hear the voice of God today? Well, I'm going to give you an exercise that I hope you guys will take pen and paper to over the course of the next few weeks. And this is your job. This is your mission, should you choose to accept it. Get out. If you have a good Bible program, use it. If not, you can get an Englishman's Concordance very, very inexpensively through Amazon, Walmart, or other third-party retailers. And look every time that scripture says, "Thus says Yahweh." Every time you see that phrase, it stands out from every other word of a prophet, from every other word of history, from everything else that is being said. Get a notebook. Write down the text and verse of what it is that God says in the "Thus says Yahweh." As you do that, you will begin to hear God's timeless and his ageless voice again. That voice will speak to you through an ancient text, and it will become a part of your life. And you can do this not just with yourselves. This is something you can do with your children. Spend 15, 20 minutes a day reading what you have found with them so that you can pass down this hearing of Yahweh's voice to our children. In Psalms 95, verses 78, David provides a remedy for us today, a remedy to heal our ability to hear God's voice, pointing out that it is the same today as it has been 3,000 years ago. In Psalms 95, verses 7 and 8, he says, "Today, if you will hear Yahweh's voice, harden not your heart." So Israel, hear the voice of Yahweh. Hear the Shema. Yahweh our God is one. Hear the words of the covenant. Hear and obey, that you may live and prosper. Shabbat Shalom. Now, we are going to take a few minutes. We are going to do a short question and answer and discussion back at the UI building. So give us about 45 minutes and we will see you guys then. Thank you.